teach me?
First learn stand, then learn fly.
Yeah.
Nature ruled on you, son, not the mine.
I know what you're trying to do.
I'm trying to free your mind, Neo. But I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
What is the most inspiring thing I ever said to you?
Don't be an idiot. Changed my life.
Welcome to another episode of the Cybersecurity Mentors podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have Matthew Dix with us, an acclaimed author whose nonfiction works like Storyworthy, Someday is Today, and his latest, StorySLAM, have captivated audiences globally. Beyond his books, Matthew is an influential speaker, elementary school teacher, and co-founder of the storytelling organization Speak Up. He teaches storytelling and public speaking at esteemed institutions such as Yale and Harvard, and collaborates with leading companies like Amazon and Slack. Matthew's storytelling prowess is unmatched, being a record 56-time Moth StorySLAM champion and 9-time GrandSLAM champion. His captivating stories have graced the Moth Radio Hour, their weekly podcast, and TED Talks. Join us for an exciting conversation about the transformative power of stories in our personal and professional lives. Welcome, Matthew Dix.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you,
We're
Matt.
happy to have you.
So let's just jump into it. So let's talk about the beginnings of your career. So what was your journey into storytelling?
It's a tricky question. When I was 10 years old, I went and saw the movie E.T. And there's a scene in E.T. that sort of breaks the movie, I think. It's sort of like a stupid scene that doesn't belong in the movie. And at 10, I was really mad about it. So I went home and I wrote a letter to Steven Spielberg telling him basically, I love all your movies, but there's always like a stupid moment in your movie. And if you would send me the movies ahead of time, I could tell you what the stupid moment is and we could fix it. And then I gave that letter to my mother and said, send it to Steven Spielberg. And then for 30 years, I was upset that he never responded to me. I thought, a kid wrote to you and you didn't send a response. And it wasn't for 30 years it took me 30 years to realize my mother never sent that letter. Like in 1981, there's no way that a mother who is barely functioning as a mother could have found Steven Spielberg's address without the internet. So she looked at it and threw it away. So then I forgave Spielberg. But that's a long way of saying I've been doing it for a long time, just sort of unaware of it. You know, I was very interested early on as a kid with the way movies functioned and the way books operated. You know, I wasn't telling my own stories back then, but I was really analyzing how stories worked and what made them excellent and what made them terrible. So I did that for a very long time. And then at 17, I started writing. I ran into a teacher who inspired me and I started writing at 17 and I've written every single day since I was 17 years old without missing a day, which sounds crazy and unrealistic, but I mean, I've lived with a woman for 18 years who can confirm that he is that crazy. He does it every day. So writing for a long time without any success, just sort of writing zines and on early versions of the internet. I was on a BBS system for a long time, writing articles for the 37 people who are also on the BBS system alongside us, writing newspapers and passing them around my neighborhood, just desperate to find someone who would listen to me. And then eventually I started writing and publishing novels. And then in 2011, my friend sent me to New York to tell a personal story on a stage for an organization called The Moth, sort of a competitive, live, true stories told without notes. And I did it on a whim, thinking I'm going to go do it once, check it off, and then move on with my life. And I went there and fell in love with storytelling that night. I won the slam. I'm highly competitive, so I like the fact that there was a winner and a loser. And so I started going to New York relentlessly, telling stories on stages, and then Boston, and then around the world. And then in 2013, I met a guy named Boris Levin, the CEO of Moth Corporation. He was at a benefit that I was doing at a synagogue. I had told about an hour of stories. And then later on during the reception, I was drinking fruit punch. And he came up to me and said, I want you to teach me to do what I just saw. And I said, I don't really work with businesses. I just make people laugh and cry, from my stories. And he said, no, you can help me. And I didn't believe him, but I say yes to everything. So I said, all right, well, I'll take a meeting with you. And 15 minutes into that meeting, I realized I was going to be able to help him. And that was the start of what has weirdly become a career that has me now working with Fortune 100 companies and nonprofits and entrepreneurs and the FBI and the clergy.
Wow.
Every day just about I get an email from some person or organization that I never thought would ever think of storytelling as something that could help them. And yet it always seems to work no matter what they do.
Yeah, and there must have been something that your friends saw. Obviously, they knew you were writing all the time, but you must have been telling stories to your friends too, but maybe not like thinking this is a career, but you love stories. So do you know what it was that they were like, man, Matt, we need to get Matt on stage?
Yeah, well, it's true. When I reflected back upon it, I realized I've been doing this for a long time. I went to my old scout camp a couple years ago with my son to show him what the scout camp looked like. And when we went into the dining hall, I saw the stage and I went, oh, I used to be the one who would call the tables to the lunchroom. I'd say like, table 3, it's time to go get your food. And in between that, I would tell stories and jokes. And I was the only one sort of doing that. I'd be like, yeah, I'll call the tables. And no one wanted to call the tables because it was table 11, go get your food. But then I'd tell a story about something that happened at the waterfront that day, or I'd say something funny that I heard, So I think what happened is I grew up in an environment where my parents were not very effective. My father left me early in my life and never really came back. I ended up with a terrible stepfather and a mother who struggled in a lot of ways to, be a parent to me. And so I didn't have any attention as a kid. And, even in high school, I got great grades, but I never entered the guidance counselor's office once. No one ever said the word college to me. I was just sort of bypassed by all these adults. And early on, I sort of figured out that the best way to get people to pay attention to me was to tell stories or make them laugh, or a combination of the two. So I think that just became my default setting was I tell stories. I have a friend who says I live out loud, which means anything that happens to me at any time, I will tell you at any time. I hold nothing back. And if you ask, my wife was once asked in my presence, thank goodness, she was once asked, when did you first fall in love with Matt? And I didn't know what her answer was going to be. I figured I took one look at him, and obviously I fell in love, and that was not the case. She told me, and she told this person, she said, we had dinner at Chili's one night when we were teaching together as colleagues, not as, anything more than colleagues, really. And if you ask me a question, which you did, and what happens is I tell you a story, which I'm now doing. You can already see this is happening. And she realized when I was telling stories that he says things that most people don't say. He shares more vulnerably than most people. He's entertaining. And basically she realized if I marry him, I'm never going to be bored. We're always going to have stuff to talk about. And so storytelling got me the best spouse in the world. But I think it all comes from the desire for attention in a place where I wasn't getting very much attention.
So what, so you mentioned teaching. Are you still teaching now?
I am. Yeah, I've been an elementary school teacher for 26 years now. So I will be back at it in September for at least a couple more years, I think, because I just love the kids. That's really, I just love kids.
Yeah, are you teaching 5th grade?
Yeah, I teach 5th grade.
5th grade.
My wife's a kindergarten teacher now. But yeah, they're 10-year-olds. And honestly, I should not be doing it. I could be doing a lot of other work that is far more profitable than going off to that classroom every day. But it's hard to imagine not having those kids in my life every year. So until I can imagine getting rid of them, I'm going to be in that classroom.
Yeah. And one thing I thought about with obviously, and there's cool stories that you tell in the book, especially The Spoon of Power. It's one of my new favorite stories that they're also a good resource for these stories. Things are happening. And also, we're talking about mentorship. You are mentoring them in a way, right? I mean, you are really, and guiding them and helping them out and giving them guidance, coaching. And that's similar to what our experience has been with students at the university. And it's awesome to see them kind of come from really start at the beginning as a freshman and then mature through their path. And I'm sure you get the same experience. I mean, you only get to really see them maybe for a year, but still, do they come back to you and you get to see them later?
You'd be surprised. Some of them are my friends, my legitimate friends now. They're adults who I play golf with. I've officiated the wedding of 2 of my former students. I see them all the time. We write to each other. We talk to each other. Not all of them, obviously, but many of them are now my friends. They're 25-year-old, human beings who I spend time with in ways that I never would have expected when I went into teaching. I'm not friends with, well, actually today I am friends with lots of my former teachers, but only because in the past 10 years, I've been reaching out to former teachers to thank them for what they've been doing. And as a result, I've struck up friendships with them in unexpected ways. So yeah, no, I'm very lucky. You're right that the classroom is a wonderful place, a resource to find stories and have real experiences. As a storyteller, I'm very cognizant of that because I want to curate my content so I don't become the guy who tells teaching stories or the guy who tells stories about his kids. So I'm always thinking about what the last story I told was a story about teaching. So the next story I'm going to tell has to be something not related to teaching. It's going to be a childhood story, a teenage story, a marriage story. So you're right. Classrooms are a wealth of storytelling opportunities. I could spend my whole life just telling classroom stories and never run out.
That's funny. Yeah, I can imagine you hear some wild stories yourself from these 5th graders. Have great imaginations.
Yes, and I teach them too. We spend a lot of time teaching them how to tell better stories, so that's really helpful for them as well.
That's great. So let's move on to your books. So how did you get to writing books? What made you decide I'm going to write some books and these are some of the titles and topics and this is what I'm going to focus into?
Well, I always wanted to write. I recognize it as an opportunity to get attention and make a name for myself. I'm also desperately terrified of death in a way that you can't even begin to imagine. Like it's in my mind all the time. And so I'm desperately trying to create a permanent record of my existence, and books are a good way to do it. So genuinely, I write books in order to prove that I once occupied a space on this planet and to live beyond my years. So I do it for all those reasons and because I genuinely love stories. So, I started writing, like I said, when I was 17. I've written many, many terrible beginnings to books for many, many years. For 17 years, actually, I wrote before I ever published a book. Eventually, I stumbled upon my writing method, which was not a writing method that I'd have really been taught. I went to college eventually and got an English degree with creative writing, and they taught me how to write to a certain degree, but not as well as they could have. But eventually I stumbled upon the method by which I am able to effectively write fiction. And I wrote a book, and I didn't think it would ever get published. I was just thrilled that I had written a book. Most people say they're going to write a book and most people don't. So even if you write a book and it doesn't get published, you're already better than most people. And I felt that. I was like, now I am better than most people. But you write a book, you figure you should try to get it published. And so I did all the things you do. I looked for an agent. I wrote 100 letters to 100 different agents over the course of a summer. And I was writing my second batch of 100 letters to the 100 next agents when I finally found my literary agent, the same one I have today. And a year after that, we sold my first novel, Something Missing, to Doubleday. It's a book about a thief who breaks into people's homes, but only steals things that go unnoticed so that he can continue to break in your home week after week and sort of slowly cull the things from your home that you don't really need. And in the process of sort of stealing from people, he gets to know them on a personal level and oddly becomes a guardian angel to some of these folks because he's interwoven in their lives that they don't, in ways they don't understand. And he's able to sort of take agency and action on their behalf because he genuinely sort of starts to like these people as he occupies their spaces and gets to know them.
Wow.
So that ended up being the first book. So I published 6 novels and now 3 books of nonfiction over the last 15 years.
Yeah, and one of your books that I've read and listened to, also awesome that you do the audiobooks. I think you do a great job. And it is great to hear the author do the audiobooks, in my opinion. It kind of is weird when you hear somebody do an interview and they talk about the book and then you listen to another person read the book. I don't know. It's a little weird. I'm sure it's super hard, but
It's
someday
the
is
worst.
today. Someday is today is the one I'm talking about.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
But just, you agree with me on the audiobooks?
Oh yeah. Well, now to be honest, I don't read my novels. I only read my nonfiction. People who read novels are pretty special. You know, when I've nonfiction, I've listened to people record novels. I'll never forget. Someone said, "Oh, do you want to meet Janet?" And I said, "Sure." And so I stood outside a sound booth and I listened to this British lady, like 75-year-old British lady, reading this book. I couldn't see her. I could just hear her, you know, and when the door opened, it was a 19-year-old Midwestern woman who came out and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I said, "That was you in there?" And, you know,
Wow.
she became a audiobook person because Audible came to her college campus, set up a booth and said, "If you'd like to audition to be an audiobook reader." And she did it on a whim and discovered that she could do 19 different accents with great accuracy. She just
Wow.
had an ear for accents. And so she dropped out of college and now records audiobooks for her life. She loves it. So those
Wow.
people have a talent
They do.
to be
Yeah,
able to
you're
do
right.
voices and accents and things like that. So we have professionals do my novels, but the nonfiction is me sharing my thoughts, my ideas, and my stories. So it's a terrible process that I despise, but I'm always glad that I have done it once it's done.
Yeah, I really appreciate it as a listener. And some days today, I really talking about your writing and how you do write, and like all the people talking about wannabe writers are like, well, I got to be in the right space. I got to have the latte and the right. And you're like, I'm writing everywhere. I'm on the curb, sitting by this in the parking lot, and I'm just writing. Like, there's no looking back at on your deathbed at 100. You want to be able to say, I did the thing.
Right. Yes. People often want to be writers in that they want to spend the hours of 10 to 2 in a coffee shop listening to smooth jazz and words magically pouring forth from their fingers. And that's not how writing works. You know, it's if you love writing, you write whenever you can. In the same way, when I was a kid, I loved basketball. I didn't wait to get to the basketball court to dribble the ball. I dribbled the ball every single place I possibly could in order to get better at dribbling. You know, so if you love something, you're not waiting for the one pristine opportunity to engage in that activity, especially if it's something you're trying to fit into your life. Most people are not writers only. You know, eventually you might get to that point where you can make a living with your writing, but you're often doing one job while trying to become a writer. So you can't afford to be precious in any way. I don't think you can afford to be precious about anything we do. I think time is limited and we should take advantage of every moment we have.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So let's talk about specifically Storyworthy and StorySLAM and kind of what was your inspiration behind them, and maybe tell our listeners a little bit about them so they can check those out.
Sure. Well, Storyworthy came from the idea that I would have people come and spend a week with me so I could teach them storytelling. You know, I ran these boot camps. And I'm in Connecticut, so there's not a lot going on here except trees and the Mark Twain House. And so I would teach at sort of local museums and libraries and things like that. And then I had this summer where 2 people from China, a person from Vancouver, a person from San Diego, and a couple from Chicago all came to Connecticut to take one of my boot camps. And I thought, what the hell is going on? Like 2 people from China? You know, and I was kind of mad because I like it when people are around the corner, because if they don't like me, like, it's not like they've invested a lot. You know, they pay me some money, they come walk. Someone coming from China to Connecticut, it's not like New York where, like, when you're done with me, you get to go out and enjoy the town. Like, there's nothing here to do if you're coming in from China. So I thought, people are coming all over the world to spend a week with me, which is great. But I bet there's a lot of people in the world that would like to get what I have to offer without having to come to Connecticut and, you know, find a hotel. So Storyworthy began in my mind as, if you're going to spend a week with me, I'm going to show you what I would teach you over the course of the book. Now, it developed into more than that, but that was the original impetus, was I want to teach people to tell better stories. And I didn't have any vision for what those stories were going to be. So, you know, if you're a minister and you're working on a sermon, or you are a business person working on a keynote, or you're someone who wants to go compete in a Moth StorySLAM, whatever you want to do, you know, all stories can be told in all these places. So it's just the idea of, let me tell you how stories work. Let me tell you how to tell them better. Let me tell you how to find them in your life, that kind of a thing. And that was the purpose of the book. And then this weird thing happened. That book published in 2017, and today it sells more than it did in 2017. Every year we sell more copies than the year before because the business world found it. And it wasn't written for business people. So business people sort of took a square peg and jammed it into a round hole and made Storyworthy work for them. And they did. Like, it genuinely works for the business community, but it wasn't my intent. And from that, my career in consulting was launched, and that's how I, work with the companies I work with today, partly because of that book. So my new book, Stories Sell, is sort of the answer to the business people. It's the story-worthy book that helps people specifically with business. So it teaches the same principles, it teaches the same ideas. A lot of Stories Sell is a version of Storyworthy, but it dives into the business applications, whether you're a entrepreneur or you're working at a Fortune 100 company or you're a marketer or a brander, all of those kinds of people. That's what the book is written for. It's for the business people specifically.
Yeah, and I came across Storyworthy from another podcast we mentioned earlier, The Art of Manliness, and for me, I had seen speakers that I really liked in cybersecurity, and I thought they do such a good job, and then figured out they were telling stories. And I reached out to some of these folks and I said, "Hey, how did you learn how to tell stories?" And they weren't sure how to tell me, but also they had maybe taken a course somewhere. Like, oh, I went and took this course at some college, and they specifically taught us how to tell stories. But it's hard to give you all that knowledge, right? To share
Right.
that down to you. But those things, like one of the things you say in the book, which really I double down, totally agree with, is that if you see what you normally see in a conference or at a business, event, in a normal meeting, work meeting, slideshows and presentations and slides, and how many of those you don't remember versus the ones that people share a story that really stick with you and you keep in your mind and it makes a difference to you. So I think that was one of the things that when I heard you talk about this and finally the black magic of how to tell stories, it was an aha moment of, wow, here's some actual tactical and things you can learn and get better at as a skill that you can use to get better at telling stories.
Yeah, I think the reason I've been successful, I think, is because I'm an elementary school teacher, honestly. I think I'm trained and experienced in taking a large, complex process and breaking it down into small, repeatable parts. It's very similar to me teaching 10-year-olds how to do long division, except in long division, if you make one mistake along the way, your answer is wrong. In storytelling, I can teach you 10 strategies, and if you use 2 of them, you're still better than you were before. Like, you can't sort of like get it wrong. You can get it less good, but it's not going to be bad. So, I really think the fact that I'm a teacher and I understand how to teach and how to develop curriculum and how to break things down into parts has been the secret sauce for me that's allowed me to be successful. Whereas I know great storytellers in the world, really fantastic people who can tell a great story, but when you ask them what they did, they don't have that lens for how did I make the decisions that I made. It's coming naturally, we'll say to them. It's really not coming naturally. They've developed and learned strategies through listening and trial and error, but they don't have that skill to sort of break it down into a part.
So can we talk about, well, John, I guess this is more for you for cybersecurity and the importance of storytelling, but giving some examples of how storytelling was an important part in cybersecurity for you, John?
Yeah, I think one of the things that one of our friends, Adam Anderson, he says for cybersecurity is the biggest or the saddest thing is a cybersecurity professional who is trying to protect their organization, who's super smart, super technical, but they can't translate that to executives and communicate effectively. Here's the risk. Here's why we need to do this. Here's why we need to protect it. And I think ultimately using stories is an excellent way to communicate that to them and tell that story of what it is story sell. You're trying to sell, hey, I believe I'm here to help protect this organization. And you're trying to communicate that to executives. How do they buy into it? How do they accept you? And how do they get that idea? So I think that's a great thought because we see it, we see this every day is you're always selling security. You're always trying to say, because you're a cost center kind of, you're not making money. And I think that this is a really helpful strategy for everybody in our field to use and get better at to help them for selling themselves in an interview, for selling cybersecurity to their business, for whatever. And just curious, have you seen that? And I think you have, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I've worked with cybersecurity folks in the past. I think that storytelling comes into play to a much greater degree when you're talking about something technical and more difficult to understand. If I am selling hammers, I'm going to tell a story, but that story is not going to be as important. It's not going to be as difficult. Everyone knows what a hammer is. They know what it does, right? I'm going to have to make a hammer seem really special in some way with the story, but I'm not going to have to explain how it works or why it's
Yeah.
important. When I work in tech, when I'm working with a company like Slack, and if you've never used Slack before and you have to explain to someone what Slack is, right? That's when a story is going to be really important. And the best stories in those circumstances tend to be stories that are related to the product, but not actually the product. It's a process I call speaking with adjacency, which is I'm going to talk about the thing, but I'm not actually going to talk about the thing. I'm going to give you an example or a metaphor about the thing that's going to be meaningful. And then when I show you how my story or my metaphor links into what I'm really talking about, that moment of connection, I think really brings comprehension to people's minds. So, the challenge for folks like you is, what am I doing? And then how can I find something in the world that's relatable to what I'm doing? I'm going to tell that relatable in the world story and then connect it to the technical thing that I am doing. And that's going to make sense to people. That it's a challenge, but that's why storytelling, I think, is more important to folks like you than anybody else. And I have learned a bit about cybersecurity. I tell my wife I have an ankle deep understanding in everything, but only an ankle deep understanding because of all the businesses I work in. But I know which stories have resonated with me in cybersecurity, the ones that have stayed with me over time, versus the ones that I have no memory of whatsoever. And it's always related to a story. It's always related to something that is relatable to me. It's kind of like you want to be telling stories that people can't wait to repeat to their friends. When you can find that kind of a story, then you've really landed on something.
Yeah, and I actually, the previous podcast episode I did, I was reading the books and told a story about an incident that happened, and I did it 3 different times. And one thing I would recommend to folks who read the books or listen to the books is pick a story, try to find a story, record it, and then revamp it throughout the book, because you'll be like, oh, okay, now I know this, or here's a way to apply what you're learning as you're listening to it. And I
love
did that. Yeah, I did that through the book, and I redid it like 4 or 5 times. And it's good. I think it's a good story. It's about what happened, but I could definitely use that story to talk about how at our university, what we're doing and how we've gone through the trenches and things like that. And then another example is, I was thinking about stories, and I think another thing that you talk about that I really like is just as a leader, a presenter, you want to be entertaining. People don't want to be bored going to meetings. There's enough meetings already that we go to that. How many of those are entertaining or exciting, or people
None.
love going to? Yeah, none.
None.
So we're going to talk about homework for life. I'm going to let you explain that, but I was going through homework for life, and it was just before July 4th, and was just kind of thinking about Wednesday was our meeting, and just a story to kind of talk about, to engage with the team. And I found a story that I hadn't made a note about, lightning and fireworks, and it was, oh, this is a good story because we're going to talk about July 4th. What are people going to do? And it wasn't like directly, here's a lesson from this to apply to the meeting, but it was entertaining and it was interesting and funny. And I was able to connect through the story with the team versus them just sitting there listening to me babble on about, bullets and highlights. Right.
Right.
So I think those are things that you can definitely, no matter where you are, you can apply to your everyday life.
Yeah. It's weird that people have this assumption that if they're on the microphone, on the stage, they're the vice president, that anyone's listening to them. I think as a storyteller, I assume no one wants to hear anything I have to say unless I give them a reason to listen. right? And that is my attitude all the time. I take a stage at the Moth. I stand there and I go, nobody likes me. No one wants to hear from me. I'd better entertain. Right now, I am assuming that some of your listeners don't want to hear me, have no reason to listen to me, and I am desperately trying to deliver in a way that keeps them listening. And I love the word entertaining because I think every speaker, wherever you are, should be entertaining. And that doesn't always mean funny. That can mean I'm going to deliver actionable information that has great meaning to your life, or I'm going to tell you something you've never heard before and you can't believe it's true, right? Or I'm going to hold you in suspense for a certain period of time, or I'm going to do something you've never seen before. There's many ways to entertain. Most people don't have that sort of thought process when they stand in front of people. They just assume everyone wants to listen to me because I'm here and I'm running the meeting, and that is the last reason anyone ever wants to listen to you. I also love what you said about just being known. So many times in business, people deliver a speech that anyone else could deliver. And if you're doing that, you might as well not deliver that speech, right? Your talk, your speech, your all hands, whatever you're doing, it should be specific to you, meaning you're revealing small parts of yourself through the process of delivering the content. Because people don't believe in ideas. They believe in people who have ideas. You can't just be a corporate monolith or a spokesperson delivering ideas. It has to be Matt, the guy who has 2 kids and he likes his cats a little too much and he doesn't play golf very well, right? But he loves his wife, right? That is a person who people want to pay attention to, as opposed to Matthew Dix, author and public speaker, which is meaningless to everyone on the planet. So we have to assume no one wants to hear anything we have to say unless we give them a reason to listen to us.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you. And I think that when you said that in the book too, it's a good mindset to go across. Like, think about that. Be that person. Don't be thinking just because you're the chief, whatever, people want to listen to you. Really assume that they don't, and you will be better because you want to be engaging.
Yeah. You will absolutely be better with that assumption. I believe it in my bones at all times.
So talk about homework for life. Just because, that's definitely a highlight for people. And one of the things you talk about is just to be a storyteller, and to be a better storyteller is to have lots of stories to tell.
Yes.
And this is a great tool that, I'll be honest, sometimes I have some laps. If I showed you my homework, I would maybe I get a B, maybe. I've had some lapses, but I come back to it. And but I really think it's effective. I showed Steven my homework for life. I was like, here it is, and he was like, wow, you really do have a lot of these. Like, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to do my homework. But and I just talked about an example where I used it. But please, if you would, just explain what is it and why would people use it?
Sure. So, early in my storytelling career, I made a list of all the stories I planned on telling, and then that list started getting short. And I didn't want to be this person who rolls out that same story every time. We know those people and we hate those people. So I decided I needed new stories all the time. And I had this inkling that my life was filled with stories if I started paying better attention. So homework is the way I solve problems, because I'm an elementary school teacher. So I gave myself this assignment first back in 2014, I think. And basically my job in the beginning was, at the end of every day, reflect on the day and write down the one thing that you think was most story-worthy, even if nothing happened. And I don't believe in sort of chores. I don't want it to be something difficult. I want it to be automatic. So what I use is a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, 2 columns, the date, and then I stretch the B column across the screen, and I only allow myself the B column to write down the story. So I only get a few sentences. And I thought, I'll write 1 a day, I'll write 30 a month, and maybe I'll find 1 new story per month. Now, today, everything has changed, and I've discovered that it changes for everybody. I used to write down about 1.2 moments per day back in 2014. Today, I write about 7.8 moments per day. I see more. I see a lot more than I ever saw before. I discovered that our lives are filled with stories that we just release or fail to notice or fail to remember. My life isn't more interesting in 2024 than it was in 2014. It's just I see more things. So back in 2014, I was looking for stories. Something happened that I can tell as a story. Today, I'm just looking for moments of meaning, something that happens that I don't want to lose. My son Charlie yesterday asked me, how come on some T-shirts there's a pocket on the T-shirt when you would never put anything in that pocket? And I went, I don't know, right? Now, I wrote that down in my homework for life. It's not really a story, but it's kind of a joke that will make people laugh. But even if I never had spoken it to anyone, It's a moment I never want to forget. So today, my homework for life contains snippets of dialogue that I say or other people say, things that I see, things that happen to me. It contains thoughts. If I think something for the first time, right, I go, oh, that's a thing. That's an intro. The other day, I was thinking I was putting my kids' crayons away. The brown crayon is never used.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the brown crayon compared to all the other crayons. And I go, is the brown crayon never used because brown is the color of poop? Right? Now, that might not actually be true, but that was the thought that went through my mind and it entered my homework for life. Today, I wondered, is the brown crayon never used because brown is the color of poop, right? I probably will never use it in a story, but those are moments we want to hold on to. The problem in our lives is our lives are filled with moments of meaning and we just dispel with them. And what happens is eventually they're gone forever. If I asked you right now, your audience can play this game. Like, how many moments can you remember from the year 2022? I'll even let you look at your calendar, right? If you're lucky, you might get 100. If you're really good, you might have 100 moments from 2022, which means you've reduced a 365-day year into 100 days. When people say time flies, that is why time flies. It does not actually fly. It gets disregarded and disremembered, right? So if you reduce 365 to 100, of course it felt like it went by quickly. It's why when you were 10, that year went by in the blink of an eye, because you can only remember 4 things from being 10, right? If you actually could remember all the days of being 10, it would not feel like it went by in the blink of an eye. I've actually reverse engineered the process. I've taken 365 and I multiply it by 7. Time actually goes by slowly for me, legitimately, because every day I'm getting about 7 things that are worth holding on to. Not all of them make it into stories. I actually did some analysis on this for the book. About 10% of the things that I write down in my homework for life end up as either part of a story themselves, or in one of my stand-up bits, because I do comedy too. Only 10%, which means 90% of the stuff I'm writing down, I'm never going to speak out loud, but is still enormously valuable to me because I'm holding on to these moments. I'm cherishing my days. I'm finding value in those days. But that's why when a company calls me and says, Matt, we've added a boring feature to our otherwise boring platform and we now must sell it to customers. Can you give us a way to sell it? There's actually a company that calls me Metaphor Man, because they call me and I give them a metaphor. Oftentimes it's not a metaphor. It's my story. It's just I tell them a story about my life, then we take me out of the story, and that is what creates the metaphor. So I've actually seen advertising and marketing of a product using a metaphor, which is actually a story from my life, where I have just been removed from the story, and now it creates the means by which they're going to sell their product.
Wow.
And the reason I always have a story to tell related to anything you're talking about is because I do homework for life. I value my days. It's the most important thing I teach, honestly. And the other beauty of homework for life is as you start to do it, you're going to crack open. Because suddenly, as you're looking at your life through the lens of storytelling, the stories you have left in the past, the ones you've left behind, they're going to come back to you. You're going to see your son do something and you're going to go, oh my God, when I was 12, I did the same thing. And now you have a moment from when you were 12, right? Or the moments will just start to connect in really meaningful ways, and you'll be able to resurrect some of that past for yourself at the same time. And I always say the person who has the most stories to tell tends to be the best storyteller. And you will become quickly the person who has the most stories to tell, so that when you have to tell a story, it's never a concern over, do I have a story to tell? It becomes, which of the multitude of stories that I have should I tell? It's a great problem to have. If people want to know more about it, there's a TED Talk I do on it. Just Google the phrase homework for life. It's worth watching. It's worth doing. You're crazy if you don't do it, honestly. I know you gave yourself a B. I give you an F, frankly, because if you're not doing it every day, you're failing. It's akin to brushing your teeth. It takes about as long as it does to brush your teeth. And I assume you don't miss a day of brushing your teeth. And if you did, it'd be an F, right? In brushing your teeth territory. So if you're not doing it every day as homework for life, you're basically just throwing days away. You're like, that day was not worth living. I might as well slept through it because I'm not going to remember it a week from now. So don't miss a day. Watch the TED Talk. It's the most important thing I teach.
Yeah, and one thing that's great that you said was, especially listening to the book, reading the book, as you tell stories, I personally, I think everybody will think of things that they could put down in their homework for life, those past memories.
Yes. Yeah. Stories beget stories for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's great too.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about one of the stories about the newspaper delivery, right? And so I wrote down in my homework for life, because I used to ride my bike everywhere. Like, this was the thing that I did. We rode our bikes. That's what we did. So I just wrote down, stories about riding my bike everywhere growing up, even late night rides where we were chased by the cops.
Yeah.
Right. Like, that just came from listening to your stories. Like, oh, I remember. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's such a joy to bring back the past. And, it's sort of like filling in the gaps that exist in your life. And it's amazing how you can remember things that you can't believe you forgot. When I was in my senior year of high school, I was getting kicked out of my house after I graduated. And I realized one of the ways to avoid getting kicked out was to not graduate. So if I could do an extra year of high school, then I could get an extra year in my house. So I went to my vice principal and said, can I stay in high school for another year? I want to take more classes. And he said, I think you might be the only person who ever asked for an extra year of high school. He actually had to go to the state and find out if I could. And it turned out I could not. I had forgotten that. Like, I forgot that for 30 years. And then it came up something was going on where one of my students was talking about graduating elementary school and not wanting to graduate to go to middle school. And suddenly I went, oh my God, you know what? I didn't want to graduate either, but that memory had been lost to me and now it's back with me. So it's crazy what we allow ourselves to forget if we're not paying attention and holding on.
Yeah. And I know we're jumping around here, but one thing I wanted to make sure we cover is just, what is a story? I think you have because people don't know, they think they know. And I thought I knew, but I think that the way you describe it is very useful for people, because there's people that say they're storytellers and whatever, but what is and you talk about this in the book too, the definition of a story and Webster's definitions, the terrible definitions.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is a story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So essentially, you're right that most people don't know what a story is. They think something happened. And if I tell you what happened, I've now told you a story. Usually that's called reporting on your life. And no one wants to hear that. Like, your spouse is required to hear it. And maybe your mother wants to hear it. But those are the only two people who should ever hear it. A story is about an actual moment in your life when something changed. You either changed fundamentally as a human being. I used to be one kind of person. Now I'm another. Or you changed in your mindset. I used to think one thing. Now I think another, right? I used to think the brown crayon was just a brown crayon. Now I'm wondering, is it the color of poop? That I could actually turn that into a story. It wouldn't be a very good one, but I could. But that's what we're looking for, is change over time. And that's every movie you've ever seen, every book you've ever read, every play you've ever seen, every television show. They're all about a protagonist, or more than one protagonist, who has something in the beginning of the story that is flawed or in need or requires fixing, or they're searching for something. And by the end of the movie, that's going to be the case. I'm watching right now the new Beverly Hills Cop movie on Netflix, right? 3 minutes into that movie, I said, well, this is a story about Axel having to get back together with his estranged daughter, and they're going to have to reconcile their relationship. Now, that's not what the movie is going to look like to most people. It's going to look like a cop drama with shooting and jokes and a helicopter, right? But at its essence, within 3 minutes, I knew, oh, this is actually a story about a father who's trying to reconcile with his daughter, right? And that is change over time. We throw in the bullets and the mayhem and the car wrecks to keep people watching the movie. Because if I said, hey, John, do you want to watch a movie about a father who has to reconcile his relationship with his daughter? You'd probably say, nah, I think I'm going to pass on that one, right? But if we fill it with all the things that Eddie Murphy can do in a movie, now we want to watch it. So that goes for everything, and stories don't need to be like that. The other night, my son, my wife, and I were at a baseball game, a minor league baseball game. And Charlie, he's 12, he's eating ice cream and he's getting it all over his shirt. Like, he can't get it from the bowl to his mouth without spilling it. And I'm looking at him and thinking, like, my son's an idiot. He can't even eat, And my wife is apparently thinking the same thing, because she looks over at him and she says, what's wrong with you, Charlie? Why can't you eat ice cream? And he turns to my wife and he says, Mom, this is called childhood. And
Wow.
like, it's a moment for me, because I said to myself, he's right. Like, 12-year-old boys are supposed to spill ice cream on their shirts because they're kids. And I had this moment of realization where I said to myself, I'm expecting too much of him. He's a 12-year-old boy. He's basically an idiot for a good reason. Like, he's supposed to be an idiot because he's 12, right? I'm getting angry at him for getting ice cream on a shirt when that's what 12-year-olds are supposed to do, right? That's nothing. But that's a moment. That's a story that I can tell. I can expand that into 5 minutes, make people laugh and cry for sure. I know it. And it doesn't involve bullets and helicopters and mayhem. It's a little boy with ice cream on his shirt, and I'm going to turn it into a story. So we don't need to have something enormous happen. Small things can be really meaningful to people. In fact, they are often the most meaningful things to people because they relate to people better than bullets and helicopters and mayhem.
Yeah, I think that's something you really do a good job of explaining, is that people think of a story and I have to tell the big thing that happened. You know, in your stories, you know, you've got some major events that have happened in your life, and those are interesting and very, you know, noteworthy. But the things that everybody can relate to, everybody's living life. Everybody has these little moments that really you can relate and connect to, and those hit the emotional heartstrings. Like, oh, that's me. What was I doing, and what was I thinking? How did that affect me? What did I live that same type of life? I
Right.
think one that you tell that's kind of related to that is with the kids, and they're all playing, and I'll let you tell the story, but you know, they're talking about whether or not they meet the expectations.
Oh, right. Oh, that was brutal. Right. Some kids are playing Never Have I Ever on the
Yeah.
sidewalk. And my version as a kid for Never Have I Ever was always inappropriate. Like, you know, never have I ever done the most vile things on the planet. So when I hear these kids saying Never Have I Ever, I go over thinking I got to put an end to this. But it's the sweetest game of Never Have I Ever I've ever experienced in my life. Like, never have I ever had chocolate ice cream. You know, never have I ever not done my homework. They're doing all these. And then they ask me to join. And I say, all right, I'll play your stupid game. This is easy. And then, you know, we play the Never Have I Evers for a little bit. And then one girl says, Never have I ever met my father's expectations. And I thought, whoa, you know, and I know the
Wow.
dad. And I was like, what are you talking about? You got a good dad. And one of them tells me, and they all agree. They all step forward. None of them have met their father's expectations, all three kids. And I'm thinking, what is going on with you? Like, I know your dads. They're good guys. And one tells me that she's a swimmer. And even if she sets a personal best, she'll come out of the water feeling great. And her father will say, and just imagine how much better it could have been if you had like nailed the kick turn, you know? So she's like, oh, we can't just enjoy the moment. You know, another one, like, I got an A on my test, you know, and they say, wouldn't it have been better if you had like studied and gotten the A week ago instead of having to do the retake, you know? And I'm sitting there going, oh my God, like, I think I do this too, you know? And I'm thinking in my head, like, I'm going to have to go home and tell my kids that they meet my expectations all the time, even though they actually don't. I'm going to at least lie to them and let them think that. Right. And then one of the girls says to me, she says, Mr. Dix, did you ever meet your father's expectations? And it just destroys me, you know? And I have to tell her, I say, my dad left when I was 7 and he never came back. So I don't really think I ever had any expectations from my father. And like simultaneously and instantaneously, all three kids reach out and grab my wrist and pull me forward. And the girl says, that counts.
Mm.
And then she tells me, she says, I'm sorry that your father abandoned you. And it's crazy because no one's ever said something like that to me in my life. And I've never thought of what my father did as abandonment. I thought of it as he left and never came back. It's the first time that someone had put that word into my head and sort of made it real for me. And it's a 10-year-old girl who does it for me. And again, that's not bullets and helicopters and mayhem. That's a little childhood game and a kid sort of saying something to you that's never been said to you before. And yeah, it's a moment I'll never forget. And those are the moments we have. I'm not a unicorn. I'm not the one only experiencing ice cream on a kid's shirt and never have I ever. We're having these moments all the time and we just ignore them. We don't see them. We don't remember them. And then we don't get a chance to tell them.
Yeah, and one thing I think that people, I know me telling stories and practicing this, is about that vulnerability, right? Like, we want to be cool. We want to be seen as cool. And I think that is something that you are really black belt level at, and, you know, laugh, laugh, cry. And I am really curious, like, it sounds simple because those are the stories that make an impact, but how do you really start getting better at being vulnerable in sharing these stories and being open to share these stories, because they can be hard. It can be a hard thing to do.
Yeah. Well, two things I tell people. One is watch me, because
Mm,
I share vulnerable stories and then somehow you like me more. Right. So say to yourself, well, he's doing it. Right. Maybe I can do it. That's one of the ways to do it. So just watch people being vulnerable. It takes no courage to speak highly of yourself. It
right.
takes no courage to brag about yourself. In this world today, there's a lot of people saying a lot of positive things about themselves. And every time I see someone doing that, I think you are so insecure. You are such a coward that you have to say nice things about yourself to make yourself feel good and to make yourself believe that other people like you.
Mm,
Right. The courage comes from saying the things that don't go said very often, the vulnerability. So one is pay attention to the people who are doing it, recognize the respect and the value they seem to have with the world, and acknowledge that it would be the same for you. The other one, unfortunately, is you just have to do it. When I was a kid, there was a high dive at one of the pools I was at. It was like 15 feet. Like it would never be allowed today. Just kids jumping off a 15-foot high dive. And I watched 100 kids go off that high dive, little, big, all these kids. And I was like, all right, again, now I'm going to go. Now I watched a bunch of people do it. Now I'm going to go do it. Climb the ladder, went out to the edge, and I was like, damn, this is ridiculous. Like I am going to die, and it's part of like you have to make the leap and realize you're not going to die. And so I made the leap that day. Even though I had seen 100 people do it before, I was still scared the first time I did it. And then I closed my eyes and I jumped and I survived. And actually the second time, it was still a little hard. Even though I had already survived it once, I went up the stupid ladder again, went out to the edge thinking it was going to be nothing now. And I was like, oh my God, I'm still afraid. I'm putting myself back in the same damn spot again. It was a little easier the second time. And then eventually I was actually diving off a 15-foot high dive, right? Probably endangering my life every single time because it was 1985. But that's what it takes too, is you have to go and do it once and recognize that it's going to be okay. And even better than okay, if you're in a situation where you're sharing something vulnerable and you get a chance to have people like come up and speak to you later about it, you're going to discover how appreciated you are. There is never a time when I share something vulnerable and people come up to me and say, why did you talk about that? They always come up to me and thank me or share something vulnerable from themselves. When you open up a space of vulnerability by telling something of yourself, people fill that space with their vulnerability too. So I am the bearer of more secrets than you could ever imagine. People tell me the craziest stuff all the damn time because I'm willing to share of myself too.
And I think too, public speaking, right? People, it's something that is similar, but I think this is a way to, number one, be better at public speaking, because you have something that you're doing. You're not just trying to convey charts and data and figures, whatever. But everybody has an intimidation of public speaking. But I think this gives you kind of a superpower to rely on to do public speaking without just having to be up there. Like you said, people don't want to listen to you, right? So I do think public speaking, again, is one of those things that you can get better at. But this, I think, can potentially accelerate the public, being a public speaker. If you want to do that, I think everybody should experience it. But use storytelling to get you better at public speaking and really be a storyteller.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I think the good news is if you're not telling stories as a public speaker, at least you're being forgotten. Because I promise you, no one remembers anything you say if you're not telling a story associated with it. If you're not landing emotion and imagery in people's minds, you'll be forgotten. So as bad as you might be, no one will remember a damn thing you said. So congratulations. You wasted everyone's time and you did nothing. Right? You accomplished absolutely nothing. And that's the way it is. Like, you've been to enough conferences, I'm sure, where you listen to 3 people speak, you hit the bathroom on the way out, you get into your car, and by the time you're in your driveway, you kind of can't remember what was said that day. And definitely 2 days later, it's all gone forever. But if someone tells a story and that story relates or matches the content or the lesson or the information they're trying to convey, when the story and the content match, now you have something to hold on to. Now you can remember it. So yeah, storytelling is the way to guarantee that you're going to entertain people. You're going to change brain chemistry along the way. That's going to improve your reception, right? People, when you tell a story, biology tells us that your brain becomes flooded with chemicals. I have flooded your brains with chemicals by telling stories, and your audience. And those chemicals, whether you want it or not, it makes you like me more, whether you want to or not. Doesn't mean you're going to like me, but you're going to like me more than you did before. It improves your cognition, meaning you're going to remember what I've said more effectively and understand it. And it releases endorphins, which makes you feel better about the world. And then you associate those good feelings of the world to me. I am the generator of good feelings when I tell a story. So if you're getting on a stage, it's stupid not to tell a story, because telling a story primes their brain for what you're about to deliver. So anytime I'm speaking, whether it's a commencement address, a TED Talk, if I'm teaching a lesson on long division to 10-year-olds, I'm starting with a story all the time. I don't stand up and say, today, boys and girls, we're going to learn how to do long division. Step one is this. I tell a story related somehow to long division so that I prime their brains, get them excited, get them entertained. And then I say, here we go. Here's the first step. If you're not doing that, you're crazy. You're making a terrible mistake. But happily, you probably suck but are being forgotten. So it's not going to be so bad.
Yeah.
So
use stories.
I've actually found myself being at conferences, just like you mentioned, and I'm listening to people talk. And I usually find myself remembering, but also trusting people who show their vulnerability, like a side of them, and that tell a story. And I find myself wanting to go talk to them afterwards. And even if it's just, hey, thank you for sharing that. Or as far as like, hey, I've gone through something similar. Thanks for sharing that. So it is very powerful. I have to agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a recognition of courage. We like to acknowledge courage. And also, honestly, it's oxytocin. They've released oxytocin into your brain, which is the empathy chemical, which makes you feel more connected to people. So like they have messed with your brain chemistry in such a way that part of it is sort of unconsciously now attached to that person. But I think also we like to see people do things well. It's the same reason if you watch someone win a baseball game, you want to go congratulate them on their victory. You know, if you see a paramedic bring someone back to life on the side of the road, like you want to shake that person's hand. You know, we recognize expertise, we recognize courage, all of those things cause us to believe in people more than we otherwise would.
Absolutely.
And I think there's two chapters that were my favorite in StorySLAM I wanted to mention. One is the humor chapter, you know, how to include humor. I think you could do a whole book on, I know you teach courses on this, but I think you could do a whole book on how to include humor, how to find it, how to include it. I really enjoyed that chapter. And I try to be funny. Stephen will tell you, sometimes I'm funny, sometimes I'm not. It's okay. But at least I try.
He's working on it. He's working on it.
Yeah. The other one that I think that's as far as practical, and one of the things you talk about is Band-Aids versus bricks, right? And people can jump to this chapter, but really you want to build the bricks. But I think how not to build a deck should be like on all the conference rooms, right? You start the meeting. Here's how not to do a deck, and all conferences should have this. I think those are, for me, were the really, like, after all the brick building, the real practical advice on how bad, you know, PowerPoint is the devil. You hear death by PowerPoint, right? There's a reason. That's the thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think about how are you communicating that in the business side, and how do people take that when you tell them
they don't like
decks
it.
terribly?
They don't like it, but I don't care. Happily.
Yeah.
You know, the weird thing is there's just a disregard for human cognition. You know, I'm working with people and they show me a slide and there's a talk track that goes along with it. And the slide has 38 words on it and they're talking to me. And it has some graphic or some structure or some slide. It has pictures on it and words and they're talking to me. And I ask them, like, do you really think that I can read the deck? I read the slide, decode the diagram, and listen to you simultaneously, right? And I think they think yes, because that's what we always have been doing. And I agree, it's always what they've been doing, and it's why it sucks, and it's why they fail, right? So humans can't read and listen to something at the same time. It's just not going to be possible. Music might be the exception, right? But if I'm talking to someone and I've given them something to read or some diagram to decode, they have three choices. They can listen to me and ignore the slide. So why do you have a slide? They can read the slide and ignore me. So why are you talking? Most of the time, though, they're going to do the worst of the three, which is going to try to do both simultaneously. They're going to try to listen to you while reading the slide, which means comprehension collapses, and actually nothing happens over the course of that slide because they don't really get anything in the process. It's as if people think that PowerPoint is their teleprompter. And if I forget to say something, the words on the slide will fill in the places where I forgot to say something. And all of this is disastrous. All you have to do is look at Steve Jobs' slides for any one of his presentations, like 5 words on a slide at most, oftentimes no words on a slide. And my favorite slide is the blank slide, because slides are designed to support what you are saying when they are needed for that support. So if you look at me speaking, if you look at one of the decks that I use, oftentimes more than half the slides are blank slides. Because if I have nothing to show you, I don't want you looking at the screen. I want you looking at me. The speaker should be the most important thing almost all the time. So, if I'm telling you a story about Charlie and the ice cream, I might show you a picture from that night, right, to ground you in a location. And then that picture is going to go away. I'm not going to let you stare at Charlie. I don't want you staring at Charlie in his ice cream covered shirt. I want you staring at me. I am the center of attention when I am speaking, not that picture. So, people leave slides up like their wallpaper. They'll be done talking about that slide. They'll be 9 miles down the road, and I'm still looking at something they were talking about 5 minutes ago. It makes no sense to me. For some reason in business, the multi-click is like eschewed. No, everyone's afraid to click more than once on a slide. So they'll say, I'm going to be talking about 3 things today, and they put up all 3 things. And I'm like, well, that's stupid, right? Because you've stolen all suspense and surprise. I would much rather say, I'm going to talk about 3 things today. The first one is this. Leave the other 2 as a mystery. That creates suspense. It makes people want to know what the other 2. It creates mental buckets in their schema. And as soon as you create a mental bucket, it must be filled. So they're not going to leave because they want to know what the other 2 things are unless you tell them ahead of time, because you don't want to click 3 times on that slide, right? Which is crazy, but people do that all the time. So there's a lot of things we can do to improve slides, but mostly we can limit our slides, limit the words on our slides, use lots of blank slides, and we can start to think about slides in storytelling, meaning a slide is not like a complete chapter in your talk. It should be leading people to the next thing you're about to show them. I always say the most valuable real estate on a slide is the bottom third, because the bottom third is the third that's going to carry you to the next slide. If you say 5 ways to solve the problem and then you list all 5 ways, I don't need to see the next slide because you haven't given me a reason to see the next slide, right? Your slide should be like, I'm talking, and now I want to talk about the 5 ways to solve the problem. The 5 ways to solve the problem should be on the bottom third of the previous slide, right? It should be the appetizer. They're like, oh, I want to see what the 5 are. If you put it at the top and then you just show me the 5, I can read faster than you can talk. And while you're talking, I'm already done, right? Aaron Sorkin said the worst thing you can ever do to an audience is tell them something they already know. And every damn speaker in the world who is using slides are constantly telling people things that they already know because they put it on the slide before they even spoke it out loud. Yeah,
That's
it's a disaster.
Yeah. And
Wow.
it takes courage. It will take courage to do this, but because everybody else is doing this thing, they're doing it wrong. They're doing the thing because everybody else is doing it.
Right. But why would you want to do it like everyone else? I say, don't fight on the same battlefield as everybody else. Go fight on your own. Like, you want to be different. I taught a guy how to be funny, a VP. He was going to do a talk at the Javits Center. He wanted to be funny. We built in all this humor into the talk he was going to give. Called him at the end of the day. How did it go? He said, I took out all the jokes. I said, why did you take out all the jokes? And he said, because the first 3 speakers weren't funny, so I was afraid to be funny. I said, that's the reason you should be funny. I love following someone who's not funny. I love following someone who's not telling stories. I would like to follow 97 people who don't tell stories and are unfunny. And I'd like to be the 98th one, and I would do it absolutely differently than everybody else. And the difference is I would be remembered. I said to him, well, the good news is no one will remember anything you said, so don't worry. Even though you sucked, they already forgot by now. And it's true, right? And he knew it. He was like, yeah, you're probably right. I am right. No one remembers anything you have to say unless you give them a reason to listen. And storytelling and humor are reasons to listen, not I have some things to share with you today about the company and about our progress so far, right? You can put that in an email, buddy. Don't do that.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, we're going to wrap some things up. Steve, you had any other questions we had?
No, I mean, just where could people find more of you?
Well, they could come to my house, but that would be weird. So don't do that. If you go to MatthewDix.com, you can find lots there about me. I'm actually relaunching my website in a couple of days. I'm pretty excited.
Awesome.
If you're just interested in storytelling, you can go to storyworthy.com. We have a free academy there. You can actually begin taking some storytelling lessons from me in video for free. I've got lots of free resources as well. There's also courses you can buy and things like that. My books are probably great resources. Go to my YouTube channel. I would tell everyone to start with Homework for Life, and I would tell you to go watch the TED Talk. It's got more about it than what I've said here. I actually go even into more about it in StorySLAM because it's expanded and become a bigger process for me, a more complete process, we'll say. So if you're looking for Homework for Life, the best explanation of it is in the new book, StorySLAM. But books, videos, storyworthy.com, MatthewDix.com. You can find me in many, many places. Yep.
Yeah, and we'll add these links to everything as well.
Thank you.
in the show notes.
Yep.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted, as I was thinking about you and what you are, and kind of how, for me, you really are the Steven Spielberg of storytelling. Like,
well done. You're very kind. That's a little too much.
No, I mean, really, like for building the cinema of the mind, you are doing the same thing as a director, but for storytelling. And I think it's great that you're giving this back, and you are sharing this with the community, because I think it's a need that people don't see, and they don't realize that they don't have this in their life, and they should have it. So thank you for doing that.
I appreciate that. And it's a great comparison. I often say not the director, but the cinematographer, but director is true too. When you start to study the way that filmmakers make their films, shoot their movies, we're essentially doing the same thing as storytellers, except we're using words instead of images. We're creating the images in the mind and thinking about the camera lens. The more you can think about what that lens is pointing to as you're speaking, that can be really helpful. So yes, I like your analogy. I reject the Steven Spielberg aspect to it, but I will take the director title. That is a good title.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here. I'm sure a lot of people hopefully they took notes and will follow up.
All right. I appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Cybersecurity Mentors podcast.
Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you get all the episodes. Join us next time as we continue to unlock the secrets of cybersecurity mentorship.
Do you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover, or do you want to share your journey? Join us on Discord at Cybersecurity Mentors Podcast and follow us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, I'm John Hoyt.
And I'm Steve Higuereta.
Thank you for listening.